Okay, so as you can see from the slides that just jumped on your screen, today's speaker we are very pleased to have is Wrenn from the University of Kent. Corey is a lecturer in sociology in the School of Social Policy, Sociology and Social Research. She's the co-director also of the Centre for the Study of Social and Political Movements at the university. Among various other positions that Corey holds, she's the co-founder of the International Association of Vegan Sociologists. She's published widely in the area of effective social movement mobilization, and she's the author of several books, most recently Animals in Irish Society, which was published by SUNY Press and was out in its paperback form in January, which is wonderful. We've got a discount code that Corey's publisher has sent, and I will try and share that with everyone in the session kind of during the course of proceedings. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Corey for the main part of our session.
Sorry about that. I couldn't find the microphone unmuter thingy. Okay. Thanks very much for that, Charlie. I'm really, really excited to be here. Full disclosure, I've come down with a cold, so I'm kind of mouth breathing through this. I might have to wipe my nose a few times, but at least I'm not contagious because we are behind the computer screens. So thanks very much for tuning in for my talk today. I'm really excited to have you. I was just taking a browse through all the participants and looking in the chat. Folks are coming here from all different backgrounds and interests. Some folks who do have backgrounds in animal stuff, and some people who don't, some people who have some Irish names. So I'm really excited to see what you share in the chat. And before I even begin, I do want to invite you that this is kind of a project that is ever evolving. As you can hear from my accent, I am not Irish. So I'm kind of coming at this as just an outsider scholar. So if you have, as this presentation goes along, if you have some contributions or things come to you, or maybe you've lived in Ireland or grew up in Ireland and you have some memories you want to share about how this resonates or doesn't resonate, I would really be appreciative of that. Yeah, so this book project, I should say, started back in 2015. At the time I was living in Cork, and I was invited to write a book chapter for a vegan book with the University of Vienna, which actually never came to fruition. But in writing that chapter, I wanted to write about, it was about veganism, and I wanted to write about Ireland just because it was there. And I figured, you know, when I'm here, why not? But as I was writing that chapter and doing that research, I found that actually there was very, very little out there about Ireland and veganism. But as I was kind of just exploring around, I felt like there was all these connections that really needed to be made. And I just didn't think that one book chapter could contain it all. So it's actually kind of a good thing that edited book with the University of Vienna never came out, because I was able to just expand from there and turn this into a book project. And since then, I've kind of gone down different routes and published a few papers off of this, but this is really like my baby. So I'd be really, really thrilled to see if you have some other contributions and things. Because some people have already reached out to me to add new histories that I wasn't aware of. So I'm just being honest, like there was really nothing to go off of before. And I just kind of went out there and started scrounging around to see what I could come up with. And that's what this presentation is based on, is that book project. So yeah, the book just came out on paperback in January. So you can get the discount code through Charlie, and I guess it'll be down in the chat. So definitely check that out. If you can't afford the book, send me an email and we'll see what we can do. Speaking of students, because I know book prices can be a little bit exclusionary sometimes. Sweet. So what I wanted to do in this talk is, before we get going into kind of the main theory of the book, I want to highlight some of the really cool people that I learned about through this research. And I could have chosen quite a few, but I picked some of the key ones that I think will be really interesting to folks. Some of them you may have heard of. Some of them I think have just truly been lost to history, and which is quite a shame. So one of the aims with this book is to bring Ireland back into the spotlight, because unfortunately in the greater narrative of animal rights history and vegan history, vegetarian history, it tends to focus predominantly on the United States and the United Kingdom, and then the little island in between, which has had so much to do with modern animal rights, gets forgotten and overlooked. And if I'm honest, I think a lot of that has to do with this kind of post-colonial thinking where Ireland is sort of treated as backwards. And that's absolutely not correct. Ireland was actually at the forefront of a lot of our animal rights policy and kind of even vegetarian and vegan foodways. So we're going to talk about some of these key leaders, but also talk about the history of Ireland as an interesting sort of case study in what happens when a place is colonized as far as its relationship with other animals and its food systems and how much they're reliant on non-human animals. And it's an interesting case study because it's not unlike, we do have critical animal studies that are now, there's a colonial turn where they're looking in places like Asia, South America, Africa. But Ireland is kind of unique because it's in the West. But even in this Western context, you can see this theory holds a lot of weight. So the argument here is that colonial oppression and animal oppression are very much entangled. So I'm going to take you through that argument in the latter half of this presentation. And we're also going to explore some of this nation building bit. So this is a very timely presentation. This is a centennial celebration of Ireland becoming a nation state. So in a way that's kind of, it's a wild thing to think about. That's not that long ago, just 100 years ago. But it's, again, a really interesting case study, like how a country builds itself and how non-human animals are a part of that nation building. The very last bit of this presentation, I'm going to look at how veganism is understood in modern Ireland. And this is very much an informal content analysis of modern media spaces. And it's a very conflicted story, as we'll find out. Okay. So let's see if you recognize any of these folks. And by the way, type in the chat. I'd be really interested to see, like, do you know about these people? Have you never heard of these people? I'm willing to bet at least one or two of these you've never heard of them. So how well do you know your Irish animal rights history? We know a lot of the folks from the UK and a lot of the folks from the US, but what about Ireland? You maybe have heard of this guy, an MP from Galway, Richard Martin. He wasn't actually Irish. He was Anglo-Irish. He was living in Ireland. But he was representing Ireland. He was representing Galway. And he had this nickname of Humanity Dick because he just, well, he wasn't the perfect guy. He had a big gambling problem and he was a hunter, but he did have a big heart and he was very compassionate as far as a lot of the social ills at the time. And really his big claim to fame when we're looking at the history of animal rights is he had a lot to do with the formation of the Cruel Treatment of Cattle Act of 1822, which would go on to feed into the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Really, it was the first major act against animal cruelty. And by the way, cattle back then referred to lots of different animals, not just cows. He did get a lot of flack for that. This particular painting here, people sometimes we even draw him with donkey ears. One of the things he did was he would really draw attention to animal cruelty. In one case, he actually brought an abused donkey into the courtroom so that people could see what the donkey had been through. And of course, that made him a laughing stock. But nonetheless, like this act that he had such an important part in having come to fruition had major ramifications beyond that. Like I said, the SPCA kind of came out of that. And he helped them financially for a little bit before Queen Victoria came in and offered her royal patronage, which ultimately saved the SPCA and turned it into the RSPCA, later moved over to the United States and become the ASPCA. But all this really got started with an Irish guy, or a guy living in Ireland, rather. Whoops, wrong way. This guy, but you've never heard of, William Drummond, or maybe if you're Irish, you've heard of him, but for different reasons. He goes down in the history books for being a very famous naturalist. And if you actually look at his biography, like when I found this book, I'd never heard of him. And when I looked at his the biography studies on him, they don't really mention it either, even though I think this is one of the most important contributions. So out of the SPCA, William Drummond, they had an essay contest, and he sent one of his sermons, I guess you could call it a sermon, it was an essay. He wanted to send it into this SPCA essay contest, but he missed the deadline. But it moved his colleagues so much, they said, you should actually publish this, expand it and publish it as a book, which he did. So it was written in the 1820s, published in the 1830s, The Rights of Animals. I mean, One of the very first books on animal rights ever written was written by a guy in Dublin, an Irish guy in Dublin. But we don't remember that in this great narrative of the animal rights movement. And this book actually had a big influence. William Garrison, who did all the abolitionist work in the United States, he met Drummond, and Drummond gave him a copy of that. And you can actually see in his diary notes, he was so excited about that meeting, his exclamation points. He says, the rights of animals. Oh, who would have thought? He was so jazzed by that. So this book actually had a pretty good influence. And also there's a copy of it in the personal library of the president of Harvard University. So it made it around the people who were major influencers in politics in his era, an Irish guy. Frances Power Cobb, you may have heard of her. She's the one who's responsible for founding the British Union for Anti-Vivisection, WAV, which would go on to become Cruelty Free International. She's also responsible for founding the National Anti-Vivisection Society, which is still around today. And she was also responsible in all her heavy work in anti-vivisection in the creation of the Cruelty to Animals Act in 1876. She actually saw that as a bit of a failure because unfortunately it didn't really do much to stop vivisection and actually created a veneer of legitimacy for scientists. Nonetheless, it's one of the major acts that was on the books, and we can credit that again to an Irish woman. She wrote extensively on vivisection or problems with vivisection. She wasn't a vegan, she wasn't a vegetarian. In fact, she was kind of a poo-pooer of that kind of stuff. But nonetheless, she was a real powerhouse when it comes to anti-vivisection. Again, an Irish woman. So these two major anti-vivisection organizations that are still around today, Irish woman. Charlotte Despard, another just absolute powerhouse. She was actually born in Scotland, but her family was Irish. Her dad was Irish. I think her brother was in the Irish Navy or something like that. I don't know all their connections. They were well-to-do. But she was one of those people who was just in every single social justice movement of the day. She was involved in it. I could have listed some more of the things that she did, but she was involved with Irish nationalism. She was involved with anti-vivisection. So there's the brown dog statue there. She was in the Vegetarian Society. She was a suffragette. She was all kinds of different things. She was an amazing woman who worked well into her 90s. And she's buried in Ireland, actually. And one of the biggest animal rights protests to date, the biggest animal rights protests around the brown dog statue, that was part of her doing as well. So she was living in Battersea, London at the time, and she actually wanted to put this statue up as a sort of representation, a symbol of what was happening in to animals in vivisecting labs. And she intentionally chose that spot because she knew it was a hotbed of socialism, feminism, Irish nationalism. And she knew that people would get on board with this because it was a deeply intersectional sort of movement at the time. And it actually, yeah, there's a lot of protests that happened around this brown dog statue. Medical students came down and resisted. Eventually they had to take the statue down. But once again, this was a major point in the animal rights movement, the history of the movement. And we have an Irish woman to thank. George Bernard Shaw was also present for the unveiling of that statue. He was a big vegetarian advocate as well. Now, I bet you've never heard of this guy. This is one of the guys I had no clue who he was until I started doing research to this book. Jack McClellan. Jack McClellan, it was a boxer in Belfast. But after his boxing career, he just got into all sorts. He's one of those just people who did any kind of sport imaginable. But he really came to fame in the 50s and the 60s by doing these long distance swims. And this guy was completely vegan. And you can see from these pictures, he was a buff dude. And he really liked to eat just handfuls of seaweed. He was just very much so into his nutrition. But he wasn't just a vegan for nutritional purposes. He was also an ardent animal rights activist, and he was very deeply involved with the Vegan Society, the International Vegetarian Union. Locally, he was president for the Ulster Vegetarian Society. He even launched a health food chain in Northern Ireland. And I looked it up. The original store that he opened is now, I think, a butcher shop or some kind of meat store. So he's probably rolling in his grave somewhere. But this guy is really amazing because he was a celebrity. He was the first celebrity vegan, or one of the first celebrity vegans, and surely one of the first in Ireland. And it is said that more people came to watch one of his long distance swims then came down even when John F. Kennedy came to visit. So thousands of people would descend to where he's doing his swims. It was like a big carnival sort of thing. You can actually still see footage. If you Google his name, some of that old footage comes up, and it's just like a carnival atmosphere. Yeah, he was a committed vegan his whole life. You probably haven't heard of these folks either, Margaret and Brian Gunn King. They're also English born, but they spent their whole lives in Ireland, and they did a lot of amazing work in Northern Ireland to represent veganism and promote veganism. And as you can see from the bullet point list here, they were just involved in all sorts of organized vegan and vegetarian work in Ireland, but also globally. And they did this work for their whole lives. And I just think it's all this amazing stuff that happened that just gets lost to the history books when we focus on the big celebrities in the United States and the United Kingdom. Also in Ireland, and this is where this is why I encourage people in the chat to, like, if you think of stuff, let me know. Because when I was researching for this book, one of the big things in the latter half of the 20th century was the rise of direct action with the Animal Liberation Front. In the United States and the UK, these were major parts of the movement, but I could not really find any evidence of that in Ireland. So I reached out to Ronnie Lee, who actually was like the founder of ALF. And I asked him, I was like, what's going on with the ALF in Ireland? And he says, well, it really wasn't there, kind of backwards in Ireland at that time. Well, I had been doing research for this book, and I knew that Ireland had been doing all kinds of stuff. And I knew that wasn't true as far as animal rights. But I kind of took his word for it. It's like, if the guy who started ALF said there was no ALF action in Ireland, there must not have been. But that turns out to be completely not true. A colleague of mine, Mark Fitzpatrick, actually reached out to me and showed me this whole wealth of stuff that Irish activists have been doing. The problem is, when we do this historical research, is when you have clandestine activism, like what is the case with ALF, we lose record of that. So this year, he actually launched a website to start to document this amazing history. So these images here actually come from that website. It's linked down at the bottom if you want to check that out. Cool. So there's just a quick spotlight, some of the amazing things that were happening in Ireland that just got lost to the history books. So I wanted to start off with some positive, like, resistance, some stuff that was going down, because now we're going to segue into like, a little bit more depressing stuff about the history. Why was this resistance necessary? And what's so uniquely Irish about it? This is not just American or British activism in an Irish spot. It's very unique to Ireland how this resistance took place, because Ireland, unlike the United States and unlike Britain, this is a deeply colonized region. And there's a deep entanglement of the oppression of Irish humans, the oppression of Irish animals. So obviously it's a very, very long and diverse history when we're talking about the history of Ireland, and can't possibly capture all the nuance. Again, more of that detail would be in the book. But just to give us a general background so that we can build off of this towards the theory about colonialism, I want us to think back about Irish history and really challenge this stereotype that we have today about Ireland being the so-called land of meat and potatoes. And actually, that first book chapter that I wrote about this topic, I titled it The Land of Meat and Potatoes, because I was going to visit Ireland. And I was in a bar with my brother, and we were just kind of chatting with the bartender. And I said, oh, I'm going to Ireland after this week or whatever. And the guy says, what? You're vegan. What are you going to do? It's the land of meat and potatoes. And it just stuck with me, because I knew that Ireland was not bad. I was vegan, and I spent so much time there, and it wasn't really any different than the United States as far as vegan availability. But what was different is that stereotype that kind of hangs in the consciousness of folks in the West. And actually, if you look back in the history of Ireland, this relationship, this very speciesist relationship, was not at all the same as what it is now. So looking back at the early part of human history in Ireland, it was much more animist. And so what that means is that non-human animals, I don't want to romanticize this and say that it was some perfect utopia, but non-human animals and humans had a much more egalitarian relationship earlier in Irish history, certainly when compared to today. And if you look back at a lot of the folklore, the early myths, you see that non-human animals have almost human-like qualities. They can transfigure into humans, or humans can transfigure into animals. A lot of animal characteristics are revered. And so they have a major role in this early kind of knowledge making and these what archaeologists might call the dream time in Ireland, when like we're forming like where we come from. Certainly with the coming of the Celts, we know the Celtic culture is deeply animist, and that is a big part of the history, the myths, and the artwork. And in fact, hunting and killing animals in general for food was not anywhere essential as we probably think it is, what is stereotyped to be. Hunting really wasn't a major part of Irish culture. It was usually practiced for kingship ceremonies or practicing for war, those sorts of things. It wasn't a major economy, hunting animals for calories. And the same thing goes for slaughtering animals. Animals were much more useful alive, much more valuable alive. So Ireland has always been a cow culture from the very beginning. And it's thought that when Irish people came to Ireland, what, 8,000-9,000 years ago, they brought cows with them. So cows had already been domesticated by the time it was populated. But just because the cows are a major part doesn't mean that it was just a bunch of beef eaters. It was actually the opposite. They were major dairy consumers. But even as I resist to even say major dairy consumers, because even the production of dairy is heavily resource intensive. So it was still sort of a special source of calories, and definitely not a major source of calories. So we're seeing now with archaeological research is pushing back on that sort of 20th century narrative where early people just gorged on animal products. Actually, we're finding that the majority of the calories are coming from plant-based sources. But that said, again, cows are a major part of the economy, and we see that even with the language. But cows were like they were the money source at that time. And you see it not just with the language, but in place names, in the landscape. Of course, early Ireland used to be really wild and forested. But as we go through the centuries, we see that kind of green idyll that is characteristic of Ireland today. That's because of the cow culture and all the ring forts that dot across the country. It's thought to be that those are in place because of cows. Even the bodies of humans have been manipulated because of this cow culture, because in Ireland it's quite unique compared to the rest of the world in that adult humans are able to digest breast milk beyond the age of weaning. So that's a cultural and geographic adaptation based on that relationship with cows. So as we move forward from that early history, we can think about the role of Christianity shaping that, the coming of the Normans shaping that, even the Vikings coming and shaping that. Like for instance, with the Normans, when the Normans came, there's a lot of laws that were put into place to change agricultural practices, food practices, even sexual practices. And so this kind of line between humans and other animals is slowly becoming becoming more stable and more rigid with Christianity, with the Normans, and then ultimately with British colonization, that human and non-human binary becomes quite rigid and a whole lot less permeable than it had once been back in animistic times. So under British colonization, one of the major incentives for Britain to colonize Ireland was to basically turn it into an outsourced feedlot, because producing animal products is highly resource intensive. And as Britain is industrializing, it needs more and more space. It needs more raw resources. It needs more space. And so ultimately Ireland was colonized so that could be used for these food production, animal-based food production. And that means that in order to create these giant feedlots and create all this landscape for animals, that the humans had to go somewhere. So you start to see land closures and people who are pushed off their land, turned into tenants, and ultimately made extremely vulnerable and reliant on the landlords and the British government ultimately. So before, while Irish people had a very rich and varied diet on all the different indigenous plants and berries and nuts and mushrooms and seaweeds or whatever else, that gets taken away when you have people who are now kind of put on these small parcels of land that aren't really very productive. Hence the potato comes in, because the potato is so hardy, it can grow in this crappy soil that is not good for much else. If it was good for much else, you can better believe it would have been taken up for cows and sheep. So that really healthy, nutritious, plant-based diet of indigenous Irish culture has now been replaced with one that's very potato heavy, supplemented with some wild plants and with some cabbage. And when you have a whole population that is so heavily reliant on just one vegetable to survive, that's an extremely precarious position to be in. There's high food insecurity. And then, of course, very famously with the famine, multiple famines, by the way, it wasn't just one famine. It was a series of famines that took place in the 1700s and 1800s. We had a lot of suffering. So ultimately, this comes down to this changed relationship with non-human animals. As Britain bolstered its exploitation of non-human animals, it thereby bolsters its exploitation of Irish people. So that indigenous Gaelic vegetarianism, which is really a point, something to be celebrated, that has been wiped away and it's replaced with this very precarious type of vegetarianism. And keep this in mind, because this, I think, is one of the reasons why we have a lot of vegan backlash in modern times, because it's this vegetarianism of scarcity has been associated with bad times, with famine times, even though there was a different type of vegetarianism that predated that sustained people for thousands of years. And in fact, a lot of nationalists recognize this relationship. Not all of them, but quite a few of them. In the Vegetarian Society meetings, you have the president who's saying, like, this would not even happen if we didn't have animal agriculture here. People could be fed, people would have land, people would have homes if it weren't for animal agriculture. So it's explicit recognition that in order to produce all this meat and dairy to feed the colonies, to feed industrializing Britain, that's why Ireland is being oppressed so. So some people actually did advocate vegetarianism to resist British oppression. Charlotte Despard, by the way, who I mentioned a little while ago, she even operated a vegan jam factory on her property as a way of plant-based production that was indigenous. Jenny Was Power, also, she operated a vegetarian produce and restaurant place where the Republic Notice, the proclamation was actually signed on her premises, a vegetarian place. Like, what? So people actually, these intersections were widely understood at the time. And Ulysses, the book Ulysses, also talks about these vegetarian restaurants as hotbeds for nationalism. So, and also people recognize that the heavily processed foods that were being now fed to Irish people was another way of oppressing them. So taking them away from that healthy, nutritious, indigenous diet, putting them on this, like, potatoes and processed stuff and tea and flour. So that was another way of oppressing Irish people. You're probably also familiar with this animalization of Irish people. This is not just in British news and media, but also in American news and media, because with all this famine and loss of land, people, of course, flooded over to the United States in order to survive. And so there was a lot of anti-Irish rhetoric there as well. But this is a theme you see over and over again, is drawing or illustrating Irish people as though they were ape-like. And indeed, there is the so-called scientific race research of the time, like, really did believe that Irish people were not white. So when I teach in sociology, when I teach race to my students, I love to include the Irish example, because up until just a few decades ago, Irish people were not actually considered white. And as an American, I also think that's interesting when you have to check the box, what's your race? I don't ever know where to check, because this is British white or British Irish. And I'm like, well, I'm British American or white American. Sorry, white American, white British, white Irish. So even to this day, like that, there's still that racial understanding. There's white British and white Irish. So this harkens back to a time when Irish people were not considered white. And some of this research actually points to Irish people saying that they had dark skin, that they were a missing link, that, yeah, they were more ape-like than they were human. So it's a very fascinating sort of intersection here. Is as you have animals being oppressed and animalized, you have Irish people being oppressed and animalized. So this animalization process is very key to normalizing and naturalizing systems of oppression. So how did Ireland grapple with this as they're building a new nation? So they're going to be very, very, very cognizant of the fact that they have been animalized for so long. And so unfortunately, I think what has happened here is that rather than saying, you know what, let's challenge this whole animalization bit, what they do is they double down with it and say, okay, we can prove our humanity. We can prove that we are not monkeys. We can prove our humanity by becoming masters of animals ourselves. So even though this heavy reliance on animals and animal agriculture is a British introduction, its embrace is something Irish. And to be fair, after so many hundreds of years of colonial pathways that have been put into place, it seemed like the most logical path to take, or the easiest path to take. It's already been set up, the infrastructure's in place. But this was a missed opportunity where Ireland could have said, you know, instead of going on board with this animalization and humans can determine their distinction by their oppression of other animals, I mean, they went on board with that instead of challenging that. Although there were, and again, there were people at the time who were cognizant of these processes, and there was a bit of debate. So this doubling down has had serious ramifications for the experience of non-human animals, and of course for climate change, because Ireland is still, every year it's getting in trouble for its exceeding emission caps. So it went from about 1.8 million cows during the time of the famine to now there's over 6 million cows on the island. And keeping in mind that there's only like, what, 4.6 million humans in Ireland. So there's more cows than people. And it's a major, major part of Irish industry, right? So, and remember, Ireland was a very fragile state when it was kind of breaking apart from Britain and going off on its own as an independent country. So how can we get some kind of legitimacy and credibility in the world global kind of stage and platform? They went with this animal bit. And I should also mention, this is not only Ireland. We see other countries who are colonized do the same thing. India, for example, doubled down after it became independent and became one of the major, I think now the most largest producer of dairy in the world. And that's a direct result of that kind of bouncing back from colonialism and doubling down on speciesism to prove themselves. So yeah, in Ireland, we know that Ireland, this is a major, major exporter of meat and dairy. It's now part of the Irish identity. The European Union continues to subsidize it in many, many millions of euros, although on the other hand says we need to deal with climate change. So it's very kind of conflicting policies there. So Ireland has been getting in trouble for doing that. But again, this is a part of this nation building exercise. And because Irish farmers were seen as so important to pulling Ireland out of that very precarious time, because Ireland was not, of course, it was not doing so well for a few decades there, up until the 50s or 60s when it started to find its feet. They had put into place a very conservative policy where they didn't want to really trade too much with the outside world, which proved not to be very successful. But farmers were seen as so important for keeping Ireland alive through this situation. There's this, you know, it's part of this legacy. So we have this tradition, and actually I should also say, when I first started going to Ireland, I was told that it's like the farmers here, just like, oh, this like sacrosanct sort of, you know, don't mess with the farmers. I was told, don't mess with the farmers. So that part of that family heritage, also the mammies bit, where that even Irish femininity is all about providing, nurturing with animal products. So it's major, really, really ingrained in the Irish identity. On the other hand, with animal nationalism, we can also see narratives of animal cruelty used to define us versus them. So for instance, we see this in Australia, where Australia does live exports of sheep because it's a major sheep place, right? Another colonized region where animal agriculture is a big part of it. Well, they will export a lot of those sheep to Muslim countries for religious slaughter. And the conditions of transport are horrible. And supposedly the slaughtering processes there are worse. And so you get this very racialized narrative of us versus them and these Australian protests. We see something similar happening in Ireland when you have live exports to Muslim countries. Those are our animals, and those people are being cruel to animals, and we can define ourselves as a civilized nation because this is how we treat our animals. That sort of narrative, you see that in many places. We also see this uniquely to Ireland with the travelers. And the travelers are very interesting. For people who don't know who the travelers are, they're they've just recently been recognized as a unique ethnic group, but basically they're indigenous Irish people who have eschewed the sort of norms of civilized living. So they live often itinerant lifestyles, like on the move sometimes, maybe without electricity or running water. They don't go to school in a lot of cases. They have different marriage and gender norms. And historically, as Ireland was making itself a nation state, that signal, that became sort of a sore spot in this fledgling nation, like these animal-like people, we need to civilize them. So you see a lot of laws put into place to sort of try and civilize these animal-like travelers. And in a lot of ways, the way that the Irish state did that was getting at them through their horses. Horses are a major part of traveler culture. So there's another fascinating line of kind of inquiry about animal nationalism happening within Ireland. So moving down towards the kind of mediascape of veganism, this is kind of the latter half of the presentation. You see that a lot of times then veganism can be resisted because animal products are seen as a major part of the evolution of the Irish state and Irish people, right? Thinking back on that kind of the trauma of the famine and that meager plant-based diet of subsistence. So if you look at some of the responses, for instance, with Go Vegan World with Sandra Higgins, she's done a lot of work to engage with media folks, but also with the meat and dairy industries. And the language they use is very indicative of the civilizing Ireland native narrative, such as if we don't eat meat and dairy, then we'll be nutrient deficient. We'll have widespread health issues. We'll revert in some way. Irish society itself is seen as reliant on animal products in order to thrive. So the famine will sometimes be drawn on to show, like, look, vegetables let us down then. Why would we want to rely on them again? Even though obviously it wasn't the vegetables' fault, it was actually animal agriculture that created famine conditions, not the potato necessarily. We also see that I've seen some of this happening where climate change deniers will kind of attack veganism and say that it's a hoax as well. So trying to disrupt this in line with this great Irish animal agricultural narrative as though it's the authority on it. That said, veganism is definitely on the rise in Ireland. Like I said at the beginning of the lecture, it's not unlike the United Kingdom. It's not unlike the United States in this regard. So looking at the Irish Times, the mentions of veganism has increased significantly in just the past 10 years or so, significantly, right? And looking at Google Trends in Ireland as well, like the interest in veganism has increased significantly, right? So despite this rich story about Ireland being so meat heavy and dairy heavy, there's this alternate story that's kind of rising up as well. So what happens oftentimes in mainstream media when we have a threat to the nation, which is basically what veganism is, or threat to industry, is that the mainstream media will disparage that threat. So we definitely see this in mainstream vegan studies, but looking in Ireland as well. One of the major themes that I see is presenting veganism as a sideshow. So kind of, it can be a positive portrayal, but ultimately it's presented as something weird, kooky, a spectacle, if you will. So the Pear Twins, so they have like a chain of vegan restaurants in Ireland and a brand as well. When I see them spotlighted on TV and programs, it's usually tongue in cheek, like they're getting picked on a little bit. To be fair, they do have some kind of outlandish personalities, but it's not like they're being taken very seriously. It's like something to watch and kind of have a chuckle at. The same thing with Jack McClelland. Like that was a spectacle. Like I said, it was like carnival conditions when people came to watch him swim. And also you can see that they would be framed as extremists. So I'm not sure if you can see all of this newspaper clipping because of the Zoom setup, but back in the 1940s, there was a spotlight in the Irish Times on this woman who was framed as the only vegan in Ireland, and her name was Moira Henry. It's actually kind of interesting because you can get a spotlight into Irish veganism back in wartime. But again, it's presented as some kind of extreme, weird thing. Obviously, veganism is also going to be presented as a threat. So just watching current events in Ireland, we see this happening. So then the Taoiseach was this a couple of years ago, dared to mention that he was cutting back on his meat consumption. He personally was cutting back on his meat consumption. He wasn't telling the whole country to. The farmers descended, didn't they? Here's a picture where they had confronted him and they had the placards out and they were like, oh, you're trying to be a vegan. You're trying to be a vegan. All he said is he's trying to cut back on his meat consumption because of climate change, which is a real scientific fact. It's not really that radical a statement to make, but because that meat and dairy is thought so integral to the identity of Ireland and its economy, it was perceived as threatening. Also, when you see these vegan narratives appear in mainstream news at all, more often than not, who's going to have the authority? They're going to go straight to the meat and dairy industries and ask them what they think about it. And that will be presented. Their opinion will be presented as though it is the fact, it is the authority. And it's very rarely that you see people who represent veganism have a fair platform and get equal coverage. So what happens then is the Irish farmers get presented in comparison, they get presented as sensible and what is real, authentic Ireland. So as one example with Go Vegan World, and if you don't know what Go Vegan World is, it's a pretty radical grassroots organization. And all they do basically is they fund billboard campaigns, newspaper ads and bus ads that just have a simple vegan message. And they run a website where people can learn more about it. And it's just run by like one woman. It's a one woman show. And when she tried to get one of these Go Vegan signs put on the Dublin bus and Irish Rail, they refused. So they said that these things were overly emotive. By the way, that's the same response I got when I tried to submit an article to History Ireland magazine. The editor wrote back and says it's overly emotive. Okay, well, that sounds overly sexist, but whatever. We also see some disparaging comments with the National Dairy Council saying these are influencers. We need to be wary of the influencers out there to get our children. So veganism is a threat. Veganism is terrorism. This is another theme that we see elsewhere in the West. So no surprise to see this in Ireland. So if you're interested in this topic, Laura Wright, it's down here. I have a book on my desk. It's called the Vegan Studies Project. And she's written quite a bit about this, about how vegans will be framed as terrorists because they threaten such an important integral part of the state, that being the economy, the agricultural system. So you see that type of language and imagery being used quite a bit. And in fact, in the United States, that actually went into law. The Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act was a direct response to industry lobbyists who wanted to get this framed as a terrorist act. So before it was just anything that you do to interfere with animals, like that can be a problem. They changed the language in 2006 to say actually that's terrorist behavior. So very, very profound stuff. In the UK, it's a similar thing. So no surprises to see this in Ireland. For instance, if you see this picture here, this is one of Go Vegan World's ads. And in one of the radio interviews that I was listening to, the DJ was talking about how this was militant. I don't know what's militant about that, except there's some barbed wire, maybe. I mean, it's just a cow with barbed wire, but they framed this as militant and ISIS, right? Using terrorist language for just a simple picture of a cow with barbed wire. So one of the things they will do then is sensationalize vegan protests. And sometimes it does give you a bit of a laugh because these are just like peaceful people, nerds and hippies in a lot of ways, but they get framed as these like over the top type of people, right? Frightening, like the independent.ie framed it as frightening online abuse. The other way that we can disparage veganism in mainstream media is by just stripping out all the politics altogether. And so this is probably one of the more potent or prevalent themes that I see. Just framing veganism as a diet. So it's just vegan food. It has nothing to do with animal rights. There's no threat to the Irish state. Farmers are fine. It's just about food. It's just a different type of cuisine. And so you see that animal rights, environmental issues become erased from the story. And this is something that also happens in the US and in the UK. I actually just did a content analysis of UK newspapers from 2020. And only, believe it or not, folks, I coded 420 articles out of a sample of potential pool of 40-some thousand articles. And only one article centered animal rights, only one article. The rest of them were about, the McPlant at McDonald's. So on one hand, it's cool that we have much more interest in veganism, more Google searches, more articles in the Irish Times. But what kind of articles are they? Are they actually challenging speciesism and climate change? Or is it just kind of selling more stuff? So it's very, very depoliticizing. And the other thing is it gets linked with a lot of travel or trendy restaurants, things that aren't necessarily Irish. And so it becomes exotifying. And that also can feed into that bit with veganism as other. Veganism is like something about with terrorism, because when we think a lot of traditional vegan foods, tofu, tempeh, falafel, hummus, these are racialized types of foods. And I think we should kind of embrace that as well. I'm not saying that we should abandon the racialized foods. That's a major part of vegan culture as well. But my last point here is that I think that we can also embrace veganism and plant-based eating is something that's uniquely Irish as well. It's indigenous to Ireland in a lot of ways. So some of these new stories that we're seeing in media representations are celebrating vegan food. They're kind of dabbling in some of this Irish vegan cuisine. Cornucopia, it's been there for ages. It's now producing I think it's almost all vegan. It used to be vegetarian. It's responding to that. There's a new explosion in seaweed culture, vegetables, oats. Even Board Bia in Ireland is advocating farmers now get on board with the oat milk trend. So there's a lot of ways that we can now embrace Irish food to kind of get it in line with this new trend of veganism. So on one hand, we want to celebrate the fact that Ireland is a cosmopolitan place. It's very forward thinking in a lot of ways. It's always been cosmopolitan. It's been impacted and colonized and traded with so many different cultures all along these thousands of years, that we should celebrate that some of this food is not necessarily indigenous. But on the other hand, a lot of it is indigenous. Plant-based eating is not foreign to Ireland. Plant-based eating is a major source of calories for Irish people for most of Irish history. And then we haven't even talked about the Christian bit, which I don't have time to talk about, but even with fasting, even like the language, like the words for Irish words for days of the week. I just learned that this last week. It's Wednesday is the first fast or the fast day. And then Thursday is like the day between fasts. And then Friday is the first fast. So even in the language, like Gaelic language for weeks, you see the plant-based eating as part of that. They ate vegan on those days. So I think there's room to reimagine veganism then as something indigenous to Ireland, not necessarily external or other. And more importantly, this is not just about depoliticized food. This is an active resistance to that colonial oppression. It's an active removing of those imposed British foodways that have been part of Ireland for so long, which aren't sustainable. They're unhealthy for us, they're unhealthy for the environment, and they're death for non-human animals. So imagining this new indigenous Irish pre-colonial foodway and all the different exciting ways that we can do that, it's a political move. It's social justice in action. So I'm gonna leave it there, and hopefully that's inspired some comments from you guys. If you want to learn more, you can check out my book. Again, there's a discount rolling with this right now through the publisher, but I have a podcast on these topics. I have essays on this topic. I have earlier published work. All this is up on my website and it's free to see there. So thanks, guys.